My name is Daniel Brooks, and until last winter I thought I understood the shape of fear. I thought it was the jolt of nearly being hit by a speeding truck on I-95 outside Baltimore, or the hollow feeling in my chest when I found out my mother had cancer. I was wrong. Fear is not a single strike. Real fear is slow and sticky. It crawls into your bones and waits. It becomes the air you breathe without realizing it until you choke. I moved to the outskirts of Providence, Rhode Island, with my wife Laura and our 9-year-old son Ethan in October. The house sat on a narrow 2-lane road that cut through a sloping field and ended at a line of crooked maple trees. Beyond those trees lay an abandoned state mental hospital that had been shuttered since 1986. Most people in the area pretended it was not there. Realtors downplayed it. Neighbors said nothing unless you asked. The distance from our back fence to the first of the derelict buildings was about 200 yards from the first night. I noticed how the wind seemed to change direction the closer it came from that side. It carried a smell that was not rot exactly, but damp plaster and something faintly metallic. The locals said the place was sealed. The city had welded the main gates shut years ago, but I saw lights. Small ones, like flickering candles, moving behind the black windows. In late October, Laura was unpacking boxes in the kitchen while Ethan tried to build a fort from flattened cardboard. I was in the living room, adjusting a picture frame, when I noticed movement through the back window. A single pale figure was standing in the middle of the field. At first I thought it was a scarecrow, but the head shifted slightly and the arms twitched. I walked to the glass for a closer look. Whoever it was facing our house, but not directly. The head was angled slightly upward, as if watching something above the roofline. I called out to Laura, but by the time she came, the field was empty. 3 nights later, Ethan woke screaming. I ran to his room and found him curled at the foot of his bed, staring at the window. He kept saying there was a woman outside, and she had no face. I turned on the outside floodlight but saw only the trembling shadow of the maple trees. I told him he was dreaming, but my own hands shook as I tucked him back under the blanket. On November 3rd, I woke to the sound of footsteps above us. We did not have an attic you could stand in, just a crawl space filled with insulation. The sound was slow, deliberate, and heavy. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and climbed the hallway ladder. The beam cut through dust and pink insulation. No one was there. I was about to climb down when I saw something at the far corner. A square of insulation had been peeled back, and the plywood underneath was damp and stained dark brown. In the center of the stain was a single fingernail, human, jagged at the edge, as if it had been ripped away. The next week, Laura began mentioning that she heard someone knocking softly against the back door late at night. When she looked, there was nothing. Then Ethan began avoiding his own room entirely. He started sleeping on the couch and refused to explain why. One night, just after midnight, I went to refill my glass of water. Passing the living room, I saw Ethan sitting upright on the couch, his eyes wide open but blank. I thought he was awake, but he did not respond when I called his name. Slowly his head turned toward the back window. I followed his gaze. There were 3 figures at the tree line, all of them the same height, all of them thin enough that their shoulders seemed to narrow to support their heads. Even from that distance, I could see their faces were too pale. They stood perfectly still. Then in perfect unison, their heads tilted to the left. The wind from that side of the property shifted again and brought the metallic smell into the room. Ethan whispered without looking at me, "They are closer now." I froze in the doorway, unsure if what I saw was real or the play of moonlight on the trees. Then one of the figures stepped forward. The motion was wrong. Not smooth like walking, but as if each movement was a separate thought. A jerk forward. Pause. Another jerk. Pause. The others followed. I told Ethan to go upstairs to his mother, but he did not move. His eyes stayed locked on them. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him harder than I meant to. His head snapped toward me, and for a moment his pupils were so wide they swallowed the color of his eyes. He whispered again, "Do not open the door." I pulled the curtains shut and carried him upstairs to Laura. She had been asleep, but when she saw my face, she sat up instantly. I told her to keep Ethan in the bedroom and lock the door. She started asking questions, but I cut her off and went back downstairs. From the kitchen I could hear the sound of dry leaves crunching. I turned off every light and stood near the back window, trying to peer through the gap in the curtain. The figures were halfway across the field now. Even in the dark, their faces seemed almost luminous. Their heads bobbed slightly with each twitching step. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That 3 strangers were walking slowly toward my house at 1 in the morning. I gripped the flashlight in one hand and the heavy wrench from the tool drawer in the other. The sound of the wind changed again. It dropped into silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came a new sound, tapping, faint but steady. Not at the back door, this time at the glass of the living room window. I moved toward it cautiously. Through the thin slit in the curtain, I saw a face pressed against the glass. The skin was stretched tight over bone, the lips pulled back too far, as if someone had sliced the corners of the mouth. The eyes bulged forward like they were being forced out from within. The face began to slide sideways along the glass, leaving a wet smear. Something shifted in my peripheral vision. I turned just in time to see fingers curling around the edge of the kitchen window frame. They were long and pale, with nails that curved downward like claws. The tapping grew faster. I backed away toward the hallway when I heard another sound upstairs. It was Laura screaming. I dropped the wrench and ran. At the top of the stairs, I found our bedroom door wide open. Laura stood in the middle of the room, holding Ethan by the arm. He was trying to walk toward the window. She said she had locked the door, but it was open when she woke to find him standing at the glass. His hand was pressed to it, as if reaching for someone outside. I rushed over and pulled him back. His skin was ice cold. I looked out into the yard. The 3 figures were no longer in the field. They were standing directly beneath the window, looking up at us. One of them slowly raised its arm and bent a finger toward itself. A beckoning gesture. The air in the room felt thick as if the oxygen had been drained. Laura was shaking uncontrollably. Ethan began to hum under his breath, a slow, tuneless sound that made my stomach twist. I yanked him away from the window and shouted at Laura to get to the basement. Halfway down the stairs we heard glass shatter somewhere behind us. The smell of damp plaster and metal flooded the air. We reached the bottom of the stairs and shoved Laura and Ethan toward the basement door. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark hallway behind us. Something was moving there. Not running, but gliding in short, uneven bursts. The sound it made was not footsteps, but a wet dragging scrape against the floorboards. I slammed the basement door shut and twisted the lock. The hinges groaned, as if something heavy had pressed against it from the other side. Laura pulled Ethan toward the far corner near the old workbench. I grabbed the metal pole we used to prop the window open in summer. It was the only weapon left down there. The noise above us changed. Not the scrape anymore, but a series of sharp impacts like nails or bones clicking together. They moved from room to room, slowly circling above our heads. Laura's voice cracked. "What do they want?" Before I could answer, the basement door rattled. The lock held, but the wood around it creaked. Then a single knock came from the other side. Not hard, but deliberate. Ethan began to whisper again. Only this time it was not words. It was the same low, tuneless hum he had made upstairs. The sound seemed to pull at the air. The knocking stopped. Total silence. Then something spoke from the other side of the door. It was Ethan's voice. The words were muffled through the wood, but it was his tone exactly. "Dad, it's okay now? You can open the door." Laura clutched Ethan's shoulders. He was right there beside her. I shook my head and backed away from the door. The voice repeated itself. Same pitch, same pauses. "Dad, it's okay now. You can open the door." I gripped the metal pole tighter and moved to the narrow basement window. Through the dirty glass I saw movement in the yard, shapes slipping between the shadows of the maple trees. Not 3 this time, but at least a dozen. The fake voice outside the door changed. It began to laugh. Not loud, but close. A slow bubbling sound that broke into dry, choking coughs. The door frame groaned as the wood splintered near the lock. Laura was crying now, and Ethan's hum was getting louder. I turned toward him to tell him to stop, but froze. His eyes were rolled back so only the whites showed. The hum grew until the air in the basement, vibrated. Then, everything above us went silent again. We waited. Something began to tap against the small basement window. A pale face leaned into view upside down. It was one of the figures from the field, but the skin around its mouth was stretched wider now, revealing teeth that looked too long for the jaw. It smiled, then its lips moved. Not in speech, it was mouthing the same words the voice at the door had used. "Dad, it's okay now. You can open the door." Before I could react, the figure slid out of sight, and the sound of splintering wood exploded from the stairs above. Something was inside the house. Something bigger than the thin figures we had seen before. The sound it made coming down the hall was deeper, slower, as if each step was being dragged through mud. The basement door shook once, twice, then the lock snapped. The basement door swung inward, but nothing stood in the frame. The light from the hallway above spilled down the stairs in a pale wash that looked almost silver. It felt wrong, like it was not coming from any bulb I had ever seen. I took one step forward, raising the metal pole. The air at the base of the stairs shimmered slightly, as if heat were rising from an invisible surface. Then something passed through it. At first it looked like a man hunched forward, dragging his arms along the steps. But as it descended, the light bent around it. Its skin was the same color as the walls behind it, and shifted with every movement, making it hard to focus on the edges. Only the eyes were clear. Too large and too far apart, glowing faintly yellow. Laura pulled Ethan into the farthest corner. I moved between them and the thing as it reached the bottom step. The air around it dropped to a cold so sharp it hurt to breathe. It stopped 3 feet away from me and tilted its head. The glow of its eyes pulsed once. Then I heard it inside my head. "You should have opened the door." The voice was not sound. It was thought pressed hard into my skull. I swung the pole and felt it connect, but the impact was wrong. No resistance. It was like hitting thick smoke. The shape bent away from the blow, then straightened without a sound. Behind it, something else moved on the stairs. Not the thin figures. These were smaller, crawling low with joints bending in the wrong directions. The smell of damp plaster and metal thickened until it coated the back of my throat. Ethan's humming stopped. He looked straight at the thing, and spoke in a voice that was not his. "You cannot have me." The creature's head jerked toward him. The yellow eyes flared, and for the first time the thing made a physical sound. A hiss like steam forced through narrow pipes. The crawling shapes froze as if waiting for a command. Laura's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Daniel, it knows. Him." Before I could answer, the figure at the bottom of the stairs reached out. Its arm stretched longer than it should have, until the fingertips nearly touched my chest. I stepped back ready to swing again, but Ethan moved first. He walked toward it. Laura screamed and grabbed him, but he slipped from her grasp. He stopped, inches from the thing, and lifted his hand. The glow from its eyes dimmed slightly as he placed his palm flat against its chest. The basement seemed to tilt. The light from the hallway flickered. The thin figures outside the window began to press their faces to the glass again. All of them were smiling now. Ethan turned his head toward me, and for the briefest moment, I saw someone else in his expression. An adult, older, eyes that did not belong to a child. The thing recoiled as if burned and pulled back toward the stairs. The smaller crawling shapes scattered up the steps on all fours. The basement door slammed shut without being touched. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise. Ethan collapsed, and Laura caught him before he hit the floor. He was shaking violently, but conscious. He looked at me and whispered, "They will come back when the ground is ready." We stayed in the basement until the sky outside turned a pale gray. Every sound made us tense. Every creak in the wood above felt like a return. When I finally opened the basement door, the house was still and cold. The smell had faded, but the air was heavy, as if it remembered. Laura carried Ethan upstairs while I checked every window and door. Glass from the living room window lay scattered across the floor, but nothing else was broken. Outside, the field looked empty. The maple trees swayed in the wind like nothing had happened. Ethan refused to speak. His eyes followed me wherever I went, but when I asked him questions, he stayed silent. By noon, I decided to walk to the end of the property, where the field met the tree line. The grass was flattened in long, narrow paths, as if something had been dragged across it. At the edge of the trees, I found a small bundle wrapped in dirty linen. It was tied with a strip of rust-colored cloth. Inside was a single human tooth and a piece of paper so worn the ink had almost faded. The only word still clear was Providence. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee and stared out at the dark line of the trees. At some point I saw movement. Not the thin figures, but a single man walking slowly along the fence. He wore a hospital gown, and his head jerked sharply every few steps. I stepped outside with the flashlight. The beam caught his face for less than a second before he ducked out of view. His skin was pale gray, and his mouth hung open wider than it should have. I followed him toward the far end of the fence, where a gap had been cut in the wire. Beyond it, the land dipped toward the old hospital. Even from a distance, the building looked wrong. The windows were black, but some reflected light. That was not there. The roofline sagged in places, but the center tower still rose above the trees. The man in the gown stopped at the edge of the property and turned toward me. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He raised his hand and pointed toward the hospital, before stepping backward into the dark. I could not see him anymore, but I heard the faint clicking sound from the night before. It moved through the trees in a slow circle around me. I backed toward the house without turning my back on the sound. Inside, Laura was awake. She said Ethan had spoken for the first time since the morning. He told her there were people under the ground between our house and the hospital. When she asked how he knew, he said they talk to him when he sleeps. The rest of the night passed without another sound. But just before sunrise, Ethan walked into our bedroom and stood at the foot of the bed. He said they are digging. Soon they will have a way in. The sound started just after midnight. At first it was faint, like a shovel striking dirt far away. Then it grew louder and sharper until the floorboards trembled. Laura stood in the hallway clutching Ethan. His eyes were half closed, but I knew he was awake because he was whispering under his breath. I could not hear the words, but they were steady and deliberate. The noise was coming from beneath the kitchen. I moved the table aside and pressed my ear to the floor. Something was scraping against the underside of the wood. Not claws, not tools. Something softer, flesh dragging against the boards. I grabbed the crowbar from the pantry. Before I could decide whether to open the trapdoor to the crawl space, the first board cracked. A pale hand forced its way up through the gap. The fingers were long and thin, but swollen at the joints, nails chipped and caked with dirt. Laura pulled Ethan back, but he did not move his gaze from the hand. He whispered again, and the hand stopped moving. For a second I thought it might retreat. Then another hand broke through beside it, and another. The floor gave way in a violent splinter of wood. A figure crawled up from the dark. Its head was wrapped in stained gauze, and the skin on its neck was torn in places, revealing blackened tissue underneath. It moved with a jerking, rhythmed limbs bending in ways that looked painful, but never slowed. More followed. Some still wore scraps of hospital gowns, others nothing but the dirt they had been buried in. Their eyes were dull, but focused on Ethan. I swung the crowbar and connected with the first one's head. The blow caved part of the skull, but no blood spilled. It made no sound, just kept crawling toward us. Whispering grew louder. The air in the room shifted as if pressure was building. One of the creatures froze in place and tilted its head. It turned away from us and looked toward the field outside. Then, without warning, it let out a deep rattling moan. From somewhere far beyond the house, the answering sound came. Low, resonant. It vibrated in my ribs. The creatures moved faster now, some dropping back through the hole in the floor and scrambling toward the sound. Others tried to grab Ethan, but he stepped forward as if drawn by an unseen thread. Laura screamed for me to stop him, but before I could reach him, the window shattered inward. A cold wind rushed through the room, and with it came the faint smell of antiseptic and decay. Outside in the field, lights flickered, not fire, not electricity, but a pale blue glow rising from the ground in a line that led straight toward the hospital. The moaning grew louder until it was all I could hear. Ethan turned to me and spoke in a calm voice that was not his own. They are calling for the rest. If you try to stop them now, you will open the way faster. The floor shook again, this time from deeper underground. Something larger was moving beneath the house. The shaking grew violent enough to knock dishes from the shelves. The hole in the kitchen floor widened until half the room sagged over a hollow space. I could see movement below, not just the pale figures, but something else deeper in the dark, pressing against the earth until clumps of soil rained upward. Ethan was standing at the open window, staring toward the hospital. The blue lights in the field pulsed in rhythm with the tremors. Laura grabbed his arm, but the moment she touched him, her body went rigid. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She dropped to her knees as if something had drained the strength from her. I pulled her away, and her skin was cold to the touch. She blinked rapidly and whispered that she saw rooms underground, long corridors lined with beds, every bed occupied by a figure that turned its head toward her in perfect unison. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed was worse. The air felt thick, and my ears popped like I was underwater. Then the floor gave way completely. We fell through into a narrow tunnel, the walls damp and packed tight with roots. The blue glow seeped from fissures in the dirt, enough to see that the tunnel sloped downward. Behind us, the way was already closing as if the earth was swallowing it. The only path was forward. We walked for what felt like hours. The tunnel twisted and narrowed until we were forced to crawl. My hands sank into mud and something softer. I did not look closely. Eventually the tunnel widened into a stone stairwell leading up to a set of metal doors. The paint was peeling, but faint letters were still visible above them. North Wing Admittance. The doors opened on their own. Inside was a long hallway lit by the same blue glow. The walls were lined with wheelchairs and gurneys, each occupied by a figure covered in sheets. Some breathed, some did not. We moved past them slowly. Their heads turned under the sheets as we passed. No faces, just the shape of heads pressing against the cloth from inside. At the far end of the hallway stood a nurse. Her uniform was decades out of date, crisp and spotless. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone like glass. She spoke in a calm, steady tone. "He has been waiting for the boy." Ethan walked toward her without hesitation. The nurse stepped aside and opened another door. Beyond it was a room filled with medical equipment, humming softly. In the center stood a figure strapped upright to a frame of metal rods. Its body was emaciated, but its head was hidden behind a metal mask with no eye holes. The mask turned toward me, and I heard a voice inside my head. The walls above could not hold forever. "Now you will see what they buried." The voice in my head was steady but heavy, as if each word was being forced through layers of stone. "You should have stayed above ground. The soil was keeping you safe." The masked figure's chest rose and fell slowly. Tubes ran from its ribs into the walls, pulsing faintly with that same blue glow. Every pulse sent a tremor through the floor, as if the whole hospital was breathing with it. Ethan stood only a few feet away. His face was calm, his eyes unfocused. The figure's head tilted toward him. The boy hears us. He has heard us for years. That is why they moved you here. I asked what it wanted. My voice came out thin in the cold air. The mask turned toward me. Again, they built these walls to keep us from the living. We were not meant to leave, but the boy's mind opens paths where no doors exist. The nurse stepped closer, her shoes silent on the tile. You brought him here. That is all we required. The masked figure raised one hand. The fingers were long and bone-thin, the nails black and brittle. It touched the side of Ethan's head. Ethan's body tensed, but instead of pulling away, he leaned closer as if listening to something only he could hear. The walls shuddered. Somewhere deep in the hospital, metal clanged against metal. The sound was followed by a distant roar, not an animal, but the rush of air being pulled through a massive opening. The nurse's glassy eyes flicked toward the hallway we had entered from. They are coming. If they reach this room before he is ready, the way will open too wide. The masked figure's grip tightened on Ethan's head. I saw his lips move, but the words entered my mind instead of my ears. You will carry him when it begins. You will not stop. The roar grew louder, now mixed with the scraping of countless hands against tile. From the hallway, pale shapes began to emerge, dozens of figures in hospital gowns, some crawling on the ceiling, their heads twisting unnaturally to face us. The nurse moved to block them, her arms stretching impossibly long, fingers hooking into the walls like claws. Go downward. The foundation is thin there. The floor beneath us cracked. Blue light streamed through the gaps. The masked figure tore the tubes from its ribs and seized Ethan's arm. The moment their hands touched, the cracks widened and the floor gave way entirely. We fell into darkness. The fall ended abruptly in waist-deep water so cold it felt like knives. The blue glow filtered down from cracks above, casting thin shafts of light across an underground chamber the size of a cathedral. The air smelled of rust and something sweet that turned my stomach. Ethan surfaced beside me, gasping. The masked figure drifted in the water a few feet away, perfectly upright despite the current pulling at our legs. Its voice entered my mind again. Do not speak here. It will hear you. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the sound that followed made the answer clear. From the far end of the chamber came the scrape of something massive moving against stone. The sound echoed until it seemed to come from every direction. We began wading toward a set of low arches along one wall. The water deepened with every step, swallowing us to the chest, then the neck. The arches opened into a tunnel just high enough to stand in, but the ceiling dripped with a black tar that hissed when it touched the water. As we moved deeper, the walls changed. They were no longer stone but rows of narrow wooden doors. Each one had a small square opening at face height, covered by rusted metal bars. Pale eyes watched us from behind some of the openings. Others were empty, but smelled of rotting earth. Ethan slowed in front of one door. A hand slipped through the bars thin, with skin like wet paper. It brushed his cheek gently. He whispered a name I did not recognize. The masked figure pulled him away without a word. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller but worse. The walls were made of stitched-together hospital curtains, stained dark and wet. Shapes moved behind the fabric, pressing against it until the seams stretched. The water here was still, almost warm. I could feel something curling around my ankles beneath the surface. I froze. The masked figure tilted its head, as if listening. Then it reached into the water and pulled up a length of tubing attached to a human jawbone, the teeth clattering softly. Before I could react, the chamber shook. The curtains tore in unison, and the shapes behind them stepped forward. They had no faces, only smooth, pale skin where features should be. Yet I felt their eyes on me. The masked figure pushed Ethan into my arms. Run downward until the air burns your throat. There you will find the root. We plunged into a narrow passage, the faceless things following. The sound of the massive creature, scraping stone, returned, closer now, shaking the walls so hard that dirt rained from the ceiling. The passage ended in a spiral staircase of rotting wood. We stumbled down it, the steps bending under our weight. At the bottom was a single door made of black metal, warm to the touch. Behind it came the sound of slow, heavy breathing. The masked figure joined us, its voice in my head louder than ever. This is where they hid the first patient. If you open it, nothing above will survive. The breathing behind the black metal door slowed, as if the thing inside knew we were there and was waiting. My hands trembled against the warm surface. Every instinct told me to run, but the masked figure stood still, almost reverent. Ethan's eyes were wide and glassy. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I realized he was mouthing the same phrase over and over. It wants to come home. The walls around us groaned. The spiral staircase we had descended twisted in on itself. Steps snapping and falling into the water above. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs like wet sand. The masked figure stepped closer to me. You have carried him to the threshold. The choice is yours. I asked what would happen if I refused. The answer came not from the figure, but from the door itself. A slow, deep laugh that rattled the floor. Something began pushing from the other side. The metal bulged inward, glowing faintly where unseen hands pressed against it. The masked figure's voice was calm, almost tender. It will come through whether you open it or not. But if you open it, you may choose who it takes first. Ethan's small hand gripped mine. His skin was ice cold. I looked into his eyes and saw not fear, but longing. He whispered again, "Please." The bulge in the door split, a thin crack running from top to bottom. Through it seeped a red mist that clung to my skin and burned in my nostrils. The breathing became a roar, shaking the chamber so violently the curtain of black water above began to pour through the cracks in the ceiling. The masked figure removed its mask. I never saw its face, only darkness, endless and shifting, like the space between thoughts. That darkness poured forward, wrapping around Ethan and pulling him toward the crack. The boy did not resist. His lips curved into the faintest smile before the mist swallowed him. The roar deepened, becoming the sound of the earth itself tearing open. The chamber collapsed. The ceiling gave way, and the water above crashed down, dragging me into a whirlpool of black and red. My last sight before I lost the surface was the black metal door swinging open, impossibly wide, revealing a world of shapes that could not exist, and light that burned without heat. When I awoke, I was lying in a hospital bed. The room was bright and sterile. A nurse I did not recognize stood at my side, smiling too widely. Her voice was soft, almost musical. "You are very lucky. You were found just in time." But her eyes were glassy, and somewhere deep beneath the building, I could still hear the breathing.